After you finish listening to the story, don't forget to leave a comment about what you would have done in the character's place. Now, let's dive into the story. In the heart of a bustling modern city, Mark and Sophie lived a life that appeared perfect on the outside. They were a couple in their mid-30s, both professionals, Mark a successful architect and Sophie a well-established journalist. Their lives seemed well-organized, routine, and unremarkable. They had been married for 8 years, and in that time they had built a life of stability and comfort. However, as often happens in relationships, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Mark had always trusted Sophie. He adored her. She was beautiful, smart, and charming, and had an uncanny ability to make everything in their life seem effortless. They had met in their 20s, and from the very beginning it felt like fate had brought them together. But like many marriages that seem picture perfect, there were cracks invisible to everyone but the people who lived within it. It was a typical Sunday morning when Sophie told Mark she was going to visit her parents for the week. She said she needed some time to reconnect with them and that it had been too long since her last visit. Mark, having grown accustomed to her trips, didn't think much of it. Sophie often spent a few days with her parents every few months. It wasn't anything new, and Mark trusted her completely. "Don't miss me too much," Sophie teased as she zipped up her bag ready to leave. Mark smiled, ruffling her hair. "I'll try, but you know I will. I'll be back in a week," she added, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek before grabbing her purse and heading for the door. "I'll keep the home fires burning. Have a great trip, love," Mark replied, feeling a mix of affection and the slight unease that accompanied all long trips, but he brushed it off. Sophie waved goodbye and Mark stood by the window watching her drive off. It wasn't uncommon for her to take off on these little trips, so he felt no reason to doubt her. He went back to his daily routine, diving into work projects, meeting deadlines, and maintaining the life they had built. But as the days passed, something didn't sit right. It was Thursday evening when Mark noticed the first inconsistency. Sophie had always been diligent about texting him, even if just to say good night, but that night there was silence. He tried to call her, but the call went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like Sophie. She was a journalist after all, always connected, always responsive. He shook it off as her being busy with her parents, but the feeling of something being off grew. He found himself staring at his phone, waiting for her text. Nothing came. The next morning, Mark couldn't ignore his growing unease. He decided to call her parents' house to check in. When her mother picked up, Mark asked about Sophie's whereabouts. "Oh, I haven't seen Sophie today," her mother said, her voice sounding unusually distant. "She said she was going out with some friends. I thought she'd be back by now." "Out with friends?" Mark repeated, confused. Sophie had told him she was going to visit her parents, but this didn't sound right. Her mother hesitated. "Maybe she didn't mention it. She's a grown woman, Mark. You know how she is." Mark wasn't sure what to make of this. Sophie had always been open with him about her plans, so why the sudden secrecy? His mind started racing. Was there something he didn't know? Had something changed between them? His suspicions were only heightened when Sophie didn't respond to his follow-up calls or texts. At work, Mark couldn't focus. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he found himself scrolling through old pictures of them together, remembering a time when things felt simple. Yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized something was different about Sophie's behavior lately. She had been distant, less affectionate, and preoccupied. On Friday night, after another day of trying to reach her with no luck, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He pulled out the car keys, locked up the house, and drove to Sophie's parents' house to confront her directly. When he arrived, he was greeted by Sophie's mother, who looked startled to see him standing at the doorstep. "Mark, what brings you here?" she asked, her face a mask of polite concern. "I need to talk to Sophie," Mark said, his voice tight. "I haven't heard from her in days. I need to know where she is." Her mother looked uncomfortable. "She's not here, Mark. She hasn't been here since Wednesday night." The words hit Mark like a slap in the face. Wednesday night? Sophie hadn't mentioned anything about leaving early, and she definitely hadn't told him she was planning to go anywhere. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The doubts he had pushed aside now came crashing into his mind with full force. Was Sophie lying to him? Was she really visiting her parents, or was there someone else she was hiding? "I need to find her," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I'd be careful, Mark," as Sophie's mother said cryptically. "Sometimes people change. I just hope she's okay." Something in her tone struck Mark as off, and a sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he walked back to his car. Mark made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for Sophie to come back. He was going to uncover the truth no matter where it took him. The silence that had settled over their life had just been shattered. Mark's mind raced as he drove home that evening, his thoughts bouncing from one unsettling possibility to the next. Sophie's disappearance, her mother's cryptic words, and the silence from Sophie all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He arrived back at their house and sat in his car for a moment, staring at the front door. Everything about their life together was built on trust. So why, for the first time in years, did it feel like that trust was starting to crumble? He grabbed his phone, deciding to try one last time to reach Sophie. No answer, no voicemail, just an empty void. He sat back and exhaled deeply, his finger hovering over her contact. Then an idea struck him. He hadn't thought about it until now, but Sophie had always been meticulous about her phone. She had never once hidden her social media accounts from him, and she rarely locked her phone when she wasn't around. Mark walked over to the living room where Sophie's phone usually sat on the coffee table. He hesitated for just a second before picking it up. He knew it was a breach of privacy, but something was telling him to look deeper. He unlocked the screen, remembering the password she had always used, her mother's birthday. The phone's notifications were filled with missed messages and calls, but what caught his eye was a message from an unknown number. The text was short, but the words froze Mark in place. "I'll be at the usual spot tonight, can't wait to see you again." His heart pounded in his chest. What was this? Who was this person? Mark quickly scrolled through more messages and found a trail of cryptic exchanges, messages filled with longing promises of secrecy and late-night rendezvous. Sophie had been lying to him. She hadn't been visiting her parents at all. In fact, she'd been meeting someone else. But who? His hand trembled as he dialed the unknown number. The call rang twice before a voice on the other end picked up. "Hello." The voice was deep, calm, and unfamiliar. Mark's voice caught in his throat, but he managed to speak. "Who is this?" The silence on the other end was thick, as if the person was trying to decide whether to hang up or continue. Finally, the voice spoke again, low and measured. "This is a private matter. I think you should stay out of it." Mark's pulse quickened. "This is my wife you're talking about. What's going on? Who are you?" There was a long pause, then the voice replied, "You don't want to know. Trust me, it's better for everyone if you just leave it alone." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. His mind was reeling. Whoever this person was, they knew about him and Sophie enough to threaten him, enough to warn him off. But why suddenly the connection cut off? Mark stared at the phone, disbelief and confusion washing over him. His wife, the woman he loved, had been hiding something, someone from him. He wasn't going to let this go. He had to find out who was behind this and why. That night Mark couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the events of the past few days replaying over and over in his mind. He tried to make sense of it all, but it felt like a nightmare. He couldn't wake up from. Sophie had been acting differently for weeks, but he had always brushed it off. Maybe she was stressed, maybe she was just busy with work. He had never imagined this, but now that the truth was starting to surface, Mark realized just how much he didn't know about his wife and how much he had taken for granted. Sophie had always been a mystery in some ways, her moods, her quiet moments, but Mark had trusted her, loved her with everything he had, but trust was no longer enough. The next day he made a decision. He wasn't going to wait around any longer for Sophie to come back and explain herself. He would follow the clues, track down the truth no matter where it led him. He knew the first place to start was the usual spot mentioned in the text. The phrase rang in his ears like a dark omen, but it was the only lead he had. Mark spent the entire afternoon tracking down the location, narrowing it down through Sophie's social media, checking photos and mapping the locations of places she frequented. By evening he had at a small secluded bar on the outskirts of the city, a place Sophie had mentioned in passing once or twice. It was the kind of place where people went to escape the world, to find privacy and solace. Mark parked his car down the street out of view and waited. His heart pounded in his chest every minute that passed felt like an hour. He kept telling himself that he was doing the right thing, that he deserved the truth, but deep down he was afraid of what he might find. As the night grew darker, Mark saw Sophie's car pull into the parking lot. She was alone, dressed casually and looking around before she walked inside. His stomach twisted in knots. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he certainly didn't expect the sight that followed. A few minutes later a man walked in after her. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident stride. Mark didn't need to hear their conversation to know what was Happening the way they looked at each other, the easy familiarity, it was clear Sophie had been lying to him for months, maybe even longer. The man reached out, touching Sophie's arm gently. She smiled at him, her eyes softening as she whispered something in his ear. Mark's chest tightened and a dark cloud of anger and betrayal began to settle over him. The man was someone Sophie had been seeing, someone she was keeping from him. He watched as they walked to a corner booth, sitting close, their conversation lost to the noise of the bar around them. Mark didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed by the sight. His heart hurt in a way he had never imagined, but there was no turning back now. He had to confront Sophie no matter what the cost. He stood up from his place in the shadows, took a deep breath and walked toward the booth where they sat. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. Mark walked slowly, each step heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. His hands were trembling, but he forced himself to stay steady, to keep moving. As he approached the booth where Sophie and the man sat, his heart hammered in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Sophie looked up first, her eyes widening in surprise. She hadn't expected him, not like this. Her face immediately hardened, the expression of a woman caught off guard but still trying to maintain control. The man beside her looked up, to his expression shifting to one of confusion, then irritation. Mark stopped a few feet away from the table, his gaze fixed on Sophie. "Sophie," he said, his voice low but firm, the pain barely concealed. "I think we need to talk." As Sophie froze for a split second, she looked like she might say something, maybe even deny everything, but instead she glanced at the man beside her, a brief flash of panic crossing her face. The man stood up, his posture defensive, clearly ready to intervene. "Who the hell are you?" the man asked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowing as he sized Mark up. Mark didn't take his eyes off Sophie. "I'm her husband," he replied, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "And you're the one she's been hiding." Sophie's eyes flickered, a mixture of guilt and anger quickly replacing the initial shock. She opened her mouth but no words came out at first. The man standing beside her, clearly agitated, stepped forward, clearly expecting to take control of the situation. "I think you should leave," the man said, his voice dripping with authority, but Mark wasn't backing down. He had to hear it from Sophie. He wasn't leaving until he had the truth. "No," Mark replied sharply. "I'm not going anywhere. I need to hear this from her." From Sophie. Sophie, still silent, looked away, her face flushed with a mix of shame and anger. She knew this was it. There was no escaping the reality anymore. She couldn't keep up the charade. Slowly she turned back to Mark, her eyes filled with resignation. "Mark," she began, her voice shaky but determined, "this isn't what you think it is." Mark didn't let her continue. His voice rose, unable to suppress the torrent of emotions building inside him. "What is it, Sophie? A mistake? A few secret meetings? Or are you planning to tell me that this," he motioned toward the man sitting beside her, "is nothing? You've been lying to me for months and I deserve to know why." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of the words he expected, she simply exhaled a long, exhausted sigh, as though the weight of it all was finally too much to bear. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." The man beside her, Mark still didn't know his name, looked between them, seemingly frustrated with the slow pace of the conversation. "Sophie, we need to go," he said, but Sophie didn't move. Sophie shot him a sharp look, and for the first time the man hesitated, sensing the tension in the air. "Sophie," Mark said again, his voice more controlled now, "I'm listening. Tell me what happened. I deserve the truth." She took a long, shaky breath before speaking again, her voice trembling but resolute. "I met him a few months ago. It started with casual texts at first. It wasn't anything serious. I wasn't looking for this, but things got complicated. I felt like you and we were growing apart. You were so busy with work and I felt ignored, and then he listened to me, Mark. He made me feel seen." Again she paused, as though she couldn't bear to continue, but she forced herself to. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, but I didn't know how to stop." Mark stared at her, his mind reeling. He had seen the signs now, the emotional distance, the secretive behavior, but hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. The man beside her had been the catalyst for everything, the one who had filled the void that Mark hadn't even realized was there. "This is what you've been hiding?" Mark asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You've been sneaking around with him behind my back?" Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, but she nodded. I never meant to hurt you, Mark, I swear, but I've been lying to myself too. I thought I could keep it under control, but now it's out of my hands. Mark could feel the bitterness rising in his throat. So what now? Do you just walk away? Do we just pretend none of this ever happened? Sophie looked at him, her face pale, the weight of her guilt hanging heavy in the air. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to fix this. The man beside her stepped in again, his tone defensive. Sophie, let's go, he insisted, grabbing her arm lightly as if trying to pull her away from the confrontation. We've talked enough. But this time Sophie didn't move. She pulled her arm back gently and looked at Mark, her face filled with a complex mix of regret and longing. I don't know what's going to happen, Mark, as she said quietly, but I owe you more than this, more than lies. I'm sorry. Mark's heart sank. This wasn't the apology he had hoped for, but it was the only one she could give. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead he felt numb. His world, the life he had built with Sophie, was crumbling in front of him. He looked at her one last time, his voice soft but filled with pain. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sophie, but you're right about one thing. You owe me the truth, and now you've given it to me. With those words, Mark turned and walked out of the bar, leaving Sophie behind with the man she had chosen. His steps were heavy, the cold night air biting at his skin, but it felt like a brief escape from the storm that was brewing inside him. He had the truth now, but was it enough to save their marriage? Or was this the end? Mark's car hummed steadily as he drove through the empty streets, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The rawness of the conversation replayed in his mind, each word Sophie had spoken digging deeper into his chest. He had wanted clarity, and now he had it, but it felt more like a curse than a relief. He wasn't sure what to do with the truth. His thoughts wandered to the years he had spent with Sophie, how they had met, the early days full of laughter and excitement, the way she had always been his rock, his constant. The life they built together seemed so distant now, like a fragile memory. Could he ever get back to that, or had it all been a lie? Mark arrived home, the familiar walls of the house now feeling colder, emptier than ever before. The door clicked open with a sense of finality, and as he stepped inside, he was confronted with the silence. Sophie wasn't there. It felt like she had already left without saying goodbye. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or devastated. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark didn't hear from Sophie. He didn't try to reach out either. They were both left to confront their own truth, Sophie with her guilt and Mark with the overwhelming realization that his entire world had shifted. The betrayal lingered like a ghost, haunting every corner of the life they had once shared. He spent most of his time at work, his mind clouded with thoughts of what to do next. He considered leaving, moving far away, starting fresh somewhere new, but that would be running away from the pain, not confronting it, and deep down he knew he wasn't ready for that, not yet. A week later, Sophie showed up at the house. She didn't knock, just let herself in, her face drawn with the unmistakable look of someone who hadn't slept in days. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table when she entered. He looked up, his expression unreadable. She stood there for a long moment, as if unsure of what to say or how to begin. Finally Sophie spoke, her voice fragile. I've been thinking a lot, Mark, she said, her eyes red from crying. I owe you more than just an apology. I know I've broken your trust and I can't fix that, but I want you to know I never stopped loving you. I never meant for it to go this far. Mark didn't respond right away. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He felt his heart ache, but there was something else there now, a quiet understanding that this wasn't about love anymore. It was about trust, and trust had been shattered beyond repair. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sophie, he said, his voice low but steady. I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if we should even try. Sophie's face crumpled, the pain she had been carrying for so long evident in the way her body seemed to shrink in on itself. She sat down across from him, her gaze never leaving his eye. Don't expect you to forgive me, she said softly. I just wanted you to know that I regret it, that I never wanted to hurt you, but I hurt you anyway. Mark leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling. Part of him wanted to scream at her, to demand answers. He knew he'd never get another part of him, one he hadn't wanted to acknowledge, wanted to hold her, to pretend that things could go back to how they used to be, but he knew that wasn't possible. You've hurt me more than you realize, he said quietly, but I don't think I can keep living like this, pretending nothing happened. We are not the same people we were, and maybe that's the hardest part for me to accept. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand, she whispered. I've destroyed everything, haven't I? Mark didn't answer. Immediately he didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what was left between them anymore, but in the silence he realized something. He couldn't keep holding on to a version of Sophie that no longer existed, and he couldn't keep pretending that things were fine when his heart felt like it was splintering apart. "Maybe it's time we let go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's breath hitched, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The weight of what they were both saying hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. Finally Sophie wiped her eyes, standing up slowly. She didn't fight him on the decision, as if she had known deep down that this was the inevitable outcome. "I understand," she said again, her voice steady now. "I'll leave. I'll give you space, but Mark, please know that I'll always care about you. I'll always love you even if we are not together." Mark didn't respond. He stood up, his gaze lingering on Sophie for a moment before he turned away, the emptiness of the moment settling deep in his chest. Sophie left shortly after that. Mark stayed behind alone in the house they had once shared. He spent the rest of the evening packing her things, the act feeling mechanical, like he was preparing for something that had already been lost. As the days turned into weeks, Mark tried to rebuild. He found solace in small moments, working, going for long walks, visiting friends he hadn't seen in years, but the shadow of Sophie's betrayal never fully lifted. It was a scar that would remain with him, a constant reminder of what had been lost. He thought often about the man Sophie had been with, the man who had stolen her away from him, but in the end Mark realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was that Sophie had chosen to walk away, and now Mark had to learn how to walk on his own. And so life continued. The pain slowly faded into a dull ache, a memory of what had once been. Mark didn't forget, but he learned to live with the truth. There was no going back, there was only moving forward. As he stood at the edge of his life, looking out at the horizon, he finally understood sometimes letting go was the only way to find peace.